let's say, for example, we have a straight chain hydrocarbon, and this is more or less what most mineral and PAO style oils are. I get it, there's some nuance. Actually, they're branched chain paraffins, which makes them isoparaffins, but from a polarity standpoint, let's say that they're straight chains with no polarity to them. What happens when we oxidize this molecule? We're introducing oxygen, which, as we've discussed before, forms things like alcohols as well as carboxylic acids. Now, this molecule does have a net dipole across it. So oxygens love to hang on to electrons. They kind of hog them for themselves, which means that there is going to be a net density of electrons on the left-hand side of this molecule, which makes the left-hand side slightly negatively charged, the right-hand side slightly positively charged. So now we have a polar molecule. And when you compare it to all of its brothers around it, it's going to stand out because it is polar and the other ones are not. Now, this expresses itself in different ways in different base oils. So broadly speaking, when you look at the common base oils which make up lubricants, as we go from right to the left of this list, we are increasing in polarity. So PAOs are the least polar, polyalkylene glycols are the most polar. So the question here is, based on what we know about polarity, which of these base oils do you think has the highest solubility for water? Now, strictly speaking, that sentence is not really correct. I should be saying, which base oil has the greatest miscibility with water? Because when we mix two liquids together, it's miscibility. When it's a solid and a liquid, it's solubility. Now, the answer is ester. So as we mentioned, as we go from right to left, we are increasing in polarity. And water loves to dissolve or be miscible with polar molecules, right? So as we go to the left, right, polyalkylene glycols love to hold on to water. In fact, they pull the moisture out of the atmosphere. Polyalkylene glycols are fortunately quite stable in the presence of water. So when you combine those two facts, when you measure the amount of water in a polyalkylene glycol, sometimes you'll see results of 10,000 parts per million, 15,000 parts per million, and that's actually perfectly safe. Whereas in a polyalpha olefin, one of the reasons they're so popular in industrial lubricants is they readily separate out with water. So what you'll find is that in the oil reservoir, with enough residence time, the oil and the water will separate out into two completely separate layers, and you can just drain that water off by opening up the sump port. So that's one of the reasons PAOs are so popular. Now, how do we actually measure polarity? It's this thing called the aniline point. So aniline is just a molecule, and what we do is we mix it in equal proportions, so 50-50, with the kind of oil that we're trying to test. And miscibility of two liquids is temperature dependent. So as we make things warmer, we're giving them more energy. They want to mix more. So everything will eventually be miscible with each other, right? So I can get a PAO to mix in with some more water if I increase the temperature because I give everything more activity. But when we decrease the temperature, they're less likely to mix together. And so, for example, a PAO will separate out from water at a relatively high temperature, but a polyalkylene glycol is able to hold on to that water into a much lower and lower and lower temperature. And that's what we call the decreasing aniline point. So the aniline point is actually measured in degrees Celsius, and it's the point at which the two become immiscible with each other. Now, up until this point, we've had a relatively simplistic understanding of solubility. So the way that we have discussed solubility is purely in terms of polar versus non-polar bonds. And for the most part, I would say that that is good enough, right? That understanding is going to help you understand why certain products dissolve in oils and why other products do not. So, for example, in the case of turbo machinery, oxidation products in mineral oils tend to not be like all of the other molecules. So all the other molecules are non-polar, oxidation products are polar, and that's why the two want to separate out from each other. That kind of basic level of understanding is enough. But if we want to go further, what we need to understand is something called the Hansen solubility parameters. These are a more sophisticated understanding which helps map different molecules in an artificial 3D space where we kind of quantify everything based on its capacity to form dispersion forces, its polarity, as well as its capacity to form hydrogen bonds. So, as an example, If we looked at something like hexane, hexane has no polarity to it. It's incapable of forming hydrogen bonds, right? But it has some size to it, so it has some capacity for London dispersion forces. The value is about 15. Now let's look at benzene. Same number of carbons, slightly fewer hydrogens. It has a polarity ranking of 0, but it's able to form some slight hydrogen bonds, and it has some London dispersion forces to it, which are relatively similar because it's of a similar size to hexane. Now, let's look at something like cyclohexane. So it is also a cyclic molecule with 6 carbons, slightly different shape, more hydrogens, and again, if we measure it in terms of polarity, as well as hydrogen bonding, as well as London dispersion forces, then we get a single point. Now, the key with using these Hansen solubility parameters is that they are used to predict the solubility of two liquids with each other, or the miscibility of two liquids with each other. And the closer you are in this 3D space, the more likely you are to be miscible with each other. So now what happens if we introduce, for example, we try and simulate what happens when we have oxidation. So here is a very basic alcohol, which is based on cyclohexane. So this is cyclohexanol. Well, it has a little bit more polarity to it because of the oxygen. It is more capable of forming hydrogen bonds, and it has London dispersion forces, which are similar to the others. Okay, so we could plot it around there. Now what happens if we introduce sulfur? So this is a sulfur-containing molecule, which is similar in size, right? Now we've increased the polarity somewhat. So this is that purple dot. And so you can now see how different, let's say, contaminants within lubricants can affect the polarity as well as the hydrogen bonding. Now, the reason why I've used these molecules is because they have known Hansen solubility parameters, but they also give us a window into what some of our common lubricant molecules might look like. So, for example, a straight chain hydrocarbon like hexane is similar in characteristics to a PAO, which also has no polarity to it. So a PAO would look something like the green dot. Now we move on to something like benzene, which looks similar to an alkylated naphthalene. Now we're moving into that sort of purple region. So it's similar to a PAO, which is why PAOs and ANs are miscible with each other. Now let's take this a step further. This orange dot looks a little bit like an ester. So an ester is sort of like an alcohol type molecule. And now what we've increased is the capacity to form hydrogen bonds. We've increased the polarity a little bit. So it's a little bit further away, right? Now the esters are less miscible with the mineral oils. What about something like that purple dot? Well, that's what happens when we introduce mineral oil contaminants like sulfur. Now, remember, a group 1 contains a little bit of sulfur, not a huge amount. So what it means is that the more sulfur you have, it's basically taking you from the green dot to the purple dot. So because there's very little sulfur in even a group 1 base oil, you're probably only going up that line by, let's say, 5%. But you can see what the effect of sulfur has on increasing the polarity of those molecules. Now, where does water fall into this, right? Way, way, way up at the top with a hydrogen bonding value of about 42 is water. And that is truly the reason why water and oil do not mix. So it's a very, very complicated explanation, but hopefully this has given you a bit of a window into how Hansen solubility parameters are used, and that when we want to judge whether two lubricants are miscible with each other, it's not quite so simple, right? There is some pretty complex science that goes along with it. If you head over to the website lubrication.expert, I'm building a platform to make the job of a lubrication expert that much easier. There's a range of application-based training modules as well as certificate preparation, including ICML's MLA1, MLT1, VIM, and VPR. MLA2 and MLA3 are coming later this year, as well as, hopefully, CLS. There are tools for lubricant and viscosity selection, and I'm starting to run bi-weekly Zoom meetings where we can all just catch up and share our experiences as lubricant professionals. Best of all, while a range of certification courses are in the order of $1,000 US each, all of this is available for $100 US a month.